The more highly developed men of our time do not want to be guided by a creed or a dogma. They want to understand. So it is not surprising if they throw aside everything they do not understand, and religious symbols, being the least intelligible of all, are generally the first to go overboard. The sacrifice of the intellect demanded by a positive belief is a violation against which the conscience of the more highly developed individual rebels. The bridge from dogma to the inner experience of the individual has broken down. Instead, dogma is believed. It is hypostatized, as the Protestants hypostatize the Bible, illegitimately making it the supreme authority, regardless of its contradictions and controversial interpretations. As we know, anything can be authorized out of the Bible. Dogma no longer formulates anything, no longer expresses anything. It has become a tenet to be accepted in and for itself, with no basis in any experience that would demonstrate its truth. Indeed, faith has itself become that experience. The word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and then I know it. I don't need to believe it. What is needed are a few illuminating truths, but not articles of faith. Where an intelligible truth works, it finds in faith a willing ally, for faith has always helped when thinking and understanding could not quite make the grade. Understanding is never the handmaiden of faith. On the contrary, faith completes understanding. To educate men to a faith they do not understand is certainly a well-meant undertaking, but one runs the risk of creating an attitude that believes everything it does not understand. Dogmas fail on deaf ears, because nothing in our known world responds to such assertions. But if we understand these things for what they are, as symbols, then we can only marvel at the unfathomable wisdom that is in them, and be grateful to the institution which has not only conserved them, but developed them dogmatically. The man of today lacks the very understanding that would help him to believe. It is not ethical principles, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lay the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical awareness, the incontrovertible experience of an intensely personal, reciprocal relationship between man and an extra-mundane authority which acts as a counterpoise to the world and its reason. The individual's decision not to belong to a church does not necessarily denote an anti-Christian attitude. It may mean exactly the reverse, a reconsidering of the kingdom of God in the human heart, where, in the words of St. Augustine, the mysterium pascale is accomplished in its inward and higher meanings. The ancient and long obsolete idea of man as a microcosm contains a supreme psychological truth that has yet to be discovered. In former times, this truth was projected upon the body, just as alchemy projected the unconscious psyche upon chemical substances. But it is altogether different when the microcosm is understood as the interior world, whose inward nature is fleetingly glimpsed in the unconscious. The more unconscious we are of the religious problem in the future, the greater the danger of our putting the divine germ within us to some ridiculous or demoniacal use, puffing ourselves up with it, instead of remaining conscious that we are no more than the stable in which the Lord is born. Being very man means being at an extreme remove and utterly different from God. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. This cry demonstrates both the remoteness and the nearness, the outermost darkness and the dazzling spark of the divine. God in his humanity is presumably so far from himself that he has to seek himself through absolute self-surrender. And where would God's wholeness be if he could not be the wholly other? People who merely believe and don't think always forget that they continually expose themselves to their own worst enemy, doubt. Wherever belief reigns, doubt lurks in the background. But thinking people welcome doubt. It serves them as a valuable stepping stone to better knowledge. People who can believe should be a little more tolerant with those of their fellows who are only capable of thinking. Belief has already conquered the summit which thinking tries to win by toilsome climbing. The believer ought not to project his habitual enemy, doubt, upon the thinker, thereby suspecting him of destructive designs. Although the actual moment of conversion often seems quite sudden and unexpected, we know from experience that such a fundamental upheaval always requires a long period of incubation. It is only when this preparation is complete, that is to say, when the individual is ripe for conversion, that the new insight breaks through with violent emotion. Saul, as he was then called, had unconsciously been a Christian for a long time, and this would explain his fanatical hatred of the Christians, because fanaticism is always found in those who have to stifle a secret doubt. That is why converts are always the worst fanatics. A Christian of today no longer ought to cling obstinately to a one-sided credo, but should face the fact that Christianity has been in a state of schism for 400 years, with the result that every single Christian has a split in his psyche. Naturally, this lesion cannot be treated or healed if everyone insists on his own standpoint. Behind those barriers, he can rejoice in his absolute and consistent convictions and deem himself above the conflict, but outside them he keeps the conflict alive by his intransigence and continues to deplore the pig-headedness and stiff-neckedness of everybody else. It seems as if Christianity had been from the outset the religion of chronic squabblers, and even now it does everything in its power never to let the squabbles rest. Remarkably enough, it never stops preaching the gospel of neighborly love. One cannot and may not think about an object held to be indisputable. One can only assert it, and for this reason there can be no reconciliation between the divergent assertions. Thus Christianity, the religion of brotherly love, offers the lamentable spectacle of one great and many small schisms, each faction helplessly caught in the toils of its own unique rightness. The physical world and the perceptual world are two very different things. Knowing this, we have no encouragement whatever to think that our metaphysical picture of the world corresponds to the transcendental reality. Moreover, the statements made about the latter are so boundlessly varied that with the best of intentions, we cannot know who is right. The denominational religions recognized this long ago, and in consequence, each of them claims that it is the only true one, and, on top of this, that it is not merely a human truth, but the truth directly inspired and revealed by God. Every theologian speaks simply of God, by which he intends it to be understood that his God is the God. But one speaks of the paradoxical God of the Old Testament, another of the incarnate God of love, a third of the God who has a heavenly bride, and so on. And each criticizes the other, but never himself. This objectivity is just what my psychology is most blamed for. It is said not to decide in favor of this or that religious doctrine. Without prejudice to my own subjective convictions, I should like to raise the question, is it not thinkable that when one refrains from setting oneself up as an arbiter mundi and, deliberately renouncing all subjectivism, cherishes on the contrary the belief, for instance, that God has expressed himself in many languages and appeared in divers forms, and that all these statements are true, is it not thinkable, I say, that this too is a decision? The objection raised more particularly by Christians, that it is impossible for contradictory statements to be true, must permit itself to be politely asked. Does 1 equal 3? How can 3 be 1? Can a mother be a virgin? And so on. Has it not yet been observed that all religious statements contain logical contradictions and assertions that are impossible in principle, that this is in fact the essence of religious assertion? When psychology speaks of the motif of the virgin birth, it is only concerned with the fact that there is such an idea, but it is not concerned with the question whether such an idea is true or false in any other sense. The idea is psychologically true inasmuch as it exists. Religious statements without exception have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of physis. Oddly enough, the paradox is one of our most valuable spiritual possessions, while uniformity of meaning is a sign of weakness. Hence, a religion becomes inwardly impoverished when it loses or waters down its paradoxes, but their multiplication enriches because only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Non-ambiguity and non-contradiction are one-sided and thus unsuited to express the incomprehensible. Unequivocal statements can be made only in regard to immanent objects. Transcendental ones can be expressed only by paradox. The mystery of the virgin birth, or the homoousia of the Son with the Father, or the Trinity which is nevertheless not a triad, these no longer lend wings to any philosophical fancy. They have stiffened into mere objects of belief. So it is not surprising if the religious need, the believing mind, and the philosophical speculations of the educated European are attracted by the symbols of the East, those grandiose conceptions of divinity in India and the abysms of Taoist philosophy in China, just as once before the heart and mind of the men of antiquity were gripped by Christian ideas. There are many Europeans who began by surrendering completely to the influence of the Christian symbol until they landed themselves in a Kierkegaardian neurosis, or whose relation to God, owing to the progressive impoverishment of symbolism, developed into an unbearably sophisticated I-you relationship, only to fall victims in their turn to the magic and novelty of Eastern symbols. This surrender is not necessarily a defeat, rather it proves the receptiveness and vitality of the religious sense. We can observe much the same thing in the educated Oriental, who not infrequently feels drawn to the Christian symbol, or to the science that is so unsuited to the Oriental mind, and even develops an enviable understanding of them. That people should succumb to these eternal images is entirely normal. In fact, it is what these images are for. They are meant to attract, to convince, to fascinate, and to overpower. They are created out of the primal stuff of revelation and reflect the ever-unique experience of divinity. Agnosticism maintains that it does not possess any knowledge of God or of anything metaphysical, overlooking the fact that one never possesses a metaphysical belief but is possessed by it. Since the only salutary powers visible in the world today are the great psychotherapeutic systems which we call the religions, and from which we expect the soul's salvation, it is quite natural that many people should make the justifiable and often successful attempt to find a niche for themselves in one of the existing creeds and to acquire a deeper insight into the meaning of the traditional saving verities. This solution is normal and satisfying in that the dogmatically formulated truths of the Christian Church express, almost perfectly, the nature of psychic experience. They are the repositories of the secrets of the soul, and this matchless knowledge is set forth in grand symbolical images. The unconscious thus possesses a natural affinity with the spiritual values of the Church, particularly in their dogmatic form, which owes its special character to centuries of theological controversy, absurd as this seemed in the eyes of later generations, and to the passionate efforts of many great men.